listeners. Before we get into today's topic, I have a correction to our last episode in which I said Nahuatl was a good example of a Type 1 language with contentives. In fact, while such analyses do exist, it is at least not a good example, and probably does at least have distinct verbs. And while we noted that many linguists don't believe Type 7 languages actually exist, the same is true of Type 1 languages as well. But see the paper for examples of languages which Hengeveld et al. Do classify as Type 1s. Of course, the fastest way to become right about something is to be publicly wrong on the internet about it, so if you notice something else you think we've overlooked or messed up, send us an email at theory.neutral.podcast@gmail.com. Now on to today's episode.
Welcome to Theory Neutral, the podcast about stuff languages do.
I'm Jacob.
I'm Logan.
And I'm Aiden. And today we're going to be talking about a paper by Larry Hyman called How Not to Do Phonological Typology, the case of pitch accent. So basically the overall gist of this paper is why pitch accent is not a valid typological category and we should stop using it. But it gets into a lot of really interesting things about like what is typology and how should we be doing this, and a lot of really interesting theoretical questions. So we're going to kind of start talking a little about those first. Specifically, one of the first things that Hyman starts out talking about is the question of what actually are we doing in typology, and how much of it is of the, traditional sort of putting languages in boxes kind of thing versus how much are we actually, is it better to talk about properties of languages and specific features of languages. Hyman makes the point that like when you talk about a tone language, which is a very common usage of terminology even to this day, it doesn't really mean a whole lot of things other than a language that has a tone system. There's not really any other bundle of features other than the tone system that actually go along with this. Like, this isn't some sort of like, once you know it's a tone language, it's like, oh, well, there's all these things that follow from that. It's just a language that has a tone system. And if you replace the word tone with adjectives or fricative or something like that, it's like English is a fricative language. That just sounds stupid. Okay, it's a language that has fricatives, like that's not a big deal. And what we're doing when we're saying is this a tone language or not is kind of missing the point of how typology is supposed to be done, where what we should do is go in and find features that languages do differently, properties that they have, and maybe those group together, and if they do, well, that's very interesting, and then we can do some science about that. But not trying to put a whole language in a box, because languages don't really do that. They've got all these parameters, many of which vary completely independently from each other. So what we want to do is to go in and find the actual features that are varying and talk about those and how they pattern with each other and how they vary across languages and so forth.
Another thing to note is that even if you find feature bundles that pattern together, noticing that things are correlated and describing how they are correlated is generally a process that is very steeped in theoretical analysis. Once you start putting languages in boxes, you're no longer being theory neutral. Whereas if you just look at the underlying feature distributions, as long as the features that you're measuring are objective, that's a big caveat, but as long as the features are objective, the feature distributions are objective. And if you make that data available, then other people can apply whatever theoretical lens they want to it. And there's a really great quote in this paper about precisely that problem, where Hyman says, in the absence of explicit criteria and argumentation, where one draws the line between accent and tone becomes largely a matter of opinion, which in turn is no way to do typology.
Right, okay, so before we move on, let's just talk about some terminology-related questions, which are the distinction between definition and prototype. whereas definition is basically just a requirement, a property that all instances of this one notion fulfill, whereas a prototype is more of a set of characteristics which are only found in the clearest way the category appears. So that's a difference that not only might, but also will be important for the discussion.
Yeah, and the reason that this is super relevant to this discussion is because oftentimes it's thought of, like, the difference between tone and stress is thought of something as a continuum, where you have tone on the one end and stress on the other end. And what Hyman does is to, when you have a continuum like this, you sort of by definition have prototypes on each end, and as you get farther from the one prototype, you move closer to the other prototype. That's how continuums work. But what Hyman does is he goes through and he tries to set up, like, okay, so what is a prototypical stress system and what is a prototypical tone system? What are the features of those that actually, when you break it down into actual, like, objective features, what does that entail? And he says, okay, so we've done that. Now let's set up a prototype for pitch accent and see, is this a real category on its own that we can say, this is a thing. There's a prototypical pitch accent system that has this sort of feature and that sort of feature. And he comes around and says, basically, no, there's not. There are languages that have both stress and tone, which is a thing, or there are languages that just have a tone system with some weird restrictions on it that, keep it from being as prototypical a tone system. It's more like we've taken a couple of features that are more a property of stress and mixed them into a tone system, but there's no real reason to think that that's not tone. It's just tone with these extra restrictions on it. It's still a tone system. Yeah, the one point he makes the point that says, you never need a pitch accent analysis. You can always do it as if it's just tone and the concept of pitch accent didn't exist. It will always work that way.
Right. Okay. So having said that, that's a very important point, because there are some properties, some characteristics, some features that have been argued for that pitch accent, which in quotation marks, the theoretical category of pitch accent fulfills. However, it is shown later in the paper that actually tone systems as we know them also exhibit those characteristics that are often argued for to be pitch accent only. And those characteristics, those features, they have four of them: obligatoriness, culminativity, privativity, and metricality. And I will quickly explain what they are before Aidan is going to talk about how tone systems may actually also fulfill those restrictions, requirements. So that's why pitch accent isn't really a valid category. So obligatoriness means that there's at least one H-tone, one marked tone per word. Whereas culminativity is there's exactly only one marked. So obligatoriness, at least one. Culminativity, at most one, which means there can only be one and exactly one marked tone per word.
So you only have one and only one if you've got both of those features.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
So privativity means basically that there's not a contrast between, for example, H and L, but rather H and not H and null.
Yeah, H, where H is high tone if you're not familiar with the regular notation. It's just easier to say H often.
High tone versus null, or high tone versus non-high tone, which plays a role especially in, for example, in autosegmental analyses, where you have, for example, which is also a theoretical framework, but it's very useful for tonal analyses. So in that case, those lines the lines that connect, this is a bit complicated, so I'm not going to talk about it, because I think that would go too deep. But you can write us an email.
Yeah, we would need a whole podcast on that.
Yeah, exactly. So, lastly, metricality basically just refers to the feature in which the marked tone, so the high tone, the H, gets placed in ways that can interact with meter. So there's, for example, a North American language called Seneca, and there's some restrictions on how meter and tone interact, and that's not restricted to so-called pitch accent systems, as it can also appear with usual tone systems.
Yes, so, and the point that Hyman is making is all of these are prototypical features of stress, but they don't necessarily mean that you don't have a tone system, and there's a lot of tone systems, like unambiguous tone systems, that have these properties. So I'm going to go through and talk about some examples. So obligatoriness, again, which is, do you have to have at least one marked something somewhere? The example that he gives here is of Chuave, which is a new language from New Guinea, that forces you to have at least one high tone per word. But you can have more than one high tone per word. And when I say that, I mean not just like a run of high tones, but you could have a high tone, then a low tone, then a high tone again, which means, like, from an autosegmental perspective, that can't be just one high tone. That's more than one. Whereas a run could just be one that's over a bunch of different syllables. So clearly we've got more than one marking here. We don't have the culminativity feature checked. We just have the obligatoriness one. You have to have at least one. But again, it's not getting into a different sort of category of things. It's still a tone system. It's just a tone system where you have to have at least one marked tone. There's examples of culminativity sort of on the flip side, where the language only lets you have one marked high tone per word. But you can also just not have any marked high tones per word. And the example here he gives is Tinputs, which is an Austronesian language from New Guinea, where you can totally have just an all-low word. But if you have a high tone in the word, then you can't have any more high tones. There's only one place that can have a high tone. However, you still have a number of different contrasts per word. For example, like in a 4-syllable word, you can have just all low. You can have a high at the end, or you can have a high on any of the non-final syllables, because there's basically the analysis that he gives is that there's sort of 3 phonemic tone melodies. There's low high, and there's low high low, and the low high low can get assigned in one of 2 different ways. So you still have this wide variety of contrasts. It's just that you're not all able to go the full way and have more than one high tone per word. But it's still totally a tone system and doesn't make sense if you start trying to put it into accentual terms. It makes a lot more sense if you just say LHLL is like high, low, low, low on a word is a low, high, low melody. Otherwise, you'd have to start doing all sorts of complicated things to try and explain how this is going. So privativity is, again, whether or not you have more than one thing that can be marked. Is it just a contrast between high and nothing, which is a privative system, or a contrast between high and low, where the low tone has some phonological reality other than we just put it in because this didn't have a marking otherwise. He gives an example of a Sino-Tibetan language, Prinmi, that the analysis supports just having a high tone and a nothing tone. But that doesn't mean you can't get a high tone in more than one place in the word. Again, which is something that stress is just not going to let you do, that accent isn't going to let you do based on, sort of a stressy definition of accent. There's a wide variety of different places that you can put a high tone, and you can have more than one. It's just that there's not really any phonological reason to posit a low tone. That doesn't mean it's not a tone system. Again, all of the tone things are still working. It's just that it looks a little bit more like stress, so that you don't have this, like, multiple levels of phonological real thing contrasting. And then finally, on systems with metricality, again, the example that he gives is Seneca, which is a really interesting system, where high tone is assigned based on metrical feet. And the way you do this, the sort of algorithm that he gives here is you mark the first syllable as extrametrical, so you just ignore it. You build bisyllabic trochees, so heavy light feet, from left to right. You break things down into these 2-syllable foot groups, and then you assign a high tone to the first syllable of each of those groups if either of the syllables in it are closed syllables. They end in consonants. Otherwise, you don't assign a high tone. And so you can get words with more than one high tone. You can get words with no high tone. But it's totally predictable where they go based on this metrical system, which you would expect is a stress thing, because there's this sort of stress is this cyclical metrical thing. But it's still tone. I trust that there is a clear acoustic reason to not consider this a really weird stress system, that it must be tone. But apparently this is a thing that tone can do. And there's other examples that he gives here and there of various ways in which tone can kind of interact with metrical structure, not in quite as dramatic a way as it does in Seneca, but making it clear that, like, just because metricality is relevant to your tone system doesn't mean it's not a tone system. And so basically the full point that he's trying to make here with all of these examples of all of these systems that do these things sort of piecemeal is that it is piecemeal, that there's not this continuum where as you go farther along the continuum from one end to the other, you get more of these features appearing, which is a thing that happens in other sorts of systems in languages. But here you have 4 different parameters that all vary completely independently from each other. They don't form a continuum at all. So there's not any reason to define a category based on them, to say that, well, if you have one of these features, then it's not a real tone system, or if you've got some combination, they don't pattern in these ways. It's just there are some tone systems that have these properties, and they have these properties, and that's just kind of it. It's not anything more special than that.
Going back to culminativity in particular for just a moment, there's a really great absurdity argument that he gives to say that really we just shouldn't care about this particular property at all, because plenty of other features can be culminative. So there are some languages where you can only have one aspirated consonant per word. There are languages where you can only have one long vowel per word. Or there's languages where you can only have one nasal vowel or one mid-vowel per word. But nobody talks about glottalization languages or length languages. So again, if you take tone language and then replace tone with almost any other feature you can think of, it just sounds absurd. So why would we consider this to be a relevant property for defining any sort of box? But then, getting back to the issue of the continuum, later on Hyman presents an alternative model where you've basically got 4 corners of a square, because you can have stress-like features and get closer and farther away from a prototypical stress language, and you can have tone-like features and get closer and farther away from a prototypical tone language, and you can do each of those things independently. So there are languages that clearly have both stress and tone, and there are languages that clearly have neither stress nor tone, and then there are languages that have one or the other, which gives you this 2-axis square to place languages on. And that's better than just a continuum. Like, that might be a useful way to compare languages sometimes, but as Aidan was just saying, really, even those 2 axes aren't great. The space of languages is not a square. It's a higher dimensional weird thing. And because of that, near the end of the paper, Hyman says, quoting another author, Macaulay, "For each of the languages discussed in this section, one can ask the question, is it a pitch-accent language or a tone language? However, I think that is a stupid question to ask." And he goes on to say that phonological typology should characterize languages by features, not by labels. And the questions we should ask, therefore, are, what do languages do with metrical structures, and what do languages do with pitch features? Which totally anticipates the tagline for this podcast. What is stuff that languages do?
Exactly. We're not interested in what kind of a language is this, which is a question that doesn't have a sensible answer at all. But the question is, what are those things that it does? And we can say an awful lot more about that if we're not trying to take whole languages at a go and put them into some sort of box.
Maybe it might just be my being not native, but I wondered the difference between those languages have metrical structures and what do they do with them, and what do languages that have metrical structures do. Like this ambiguity, like might be actually the same thing, but I just stumbled upon that when reading it. I'm not sure. It's interesting wording, but
yeah, I mean, I think one of the potential answers to the question of like what do languages do with pitch features, the answer can be nothing for a given language. But there may be much more interesting answers to that in other languages. But I mean, nothing is definitely an interesting answer. And the fact that like you have things that are in this box of not really having any stress and not having any tone stuff going on, like French, for example, that's really interesting. There's languages that have this whole realm of supersegmental stuff that you could take advantage of, and some languages just don't do that. They're just fine.
It's also particularly interesting when you have been raised and educated in the background of a certain group or family of languages, and then you find one that doesn't have a feature you thought was obviously necessary. So, as a native English speaker, I'm not surprised to find lots of languages that don't have tone, because my native language doesn't have tone, so fine, obvious. But it's a lot cooler to find a language where the answer to what does this language do with tense features is, oh, nothing, for example.
Yes, I know. What? We don't need to mark things for that. It's fine. We don't need to do any of that nonsense. You'll get it. It's fine. One further point that I would like to make before we end here is that I think this whole discussion hinges very critically on having data from a wide range of languages. And I'm probably going to say this a million times during this podcast, but it just makes it really clear. Because I feel like, why was pitch accent created as a category in the first place? Why did people come up with this? Is because, at least sort of the way I understand it, is because some of the first languages that native European language speakers, which mostly don't use tone, except the ones that do, like Norwegian and Serbian, coming across languages like Mandarin and Cantonese and Thai and, languages from East and Southeast Asia that have these really inescapable tone systems that are very prominent in how they work. And I feel like people came to the conclusion that, like, oh, this is what a tone language is. This is the prototypical tone system. If you're not doing something like Mandarin does, then it must not be tone. And it turns out that Mandarin's tone system is really weird cross-linguistically. And this whole idea of, like, you have units, contours as phonological units, and every syllable is always marked with some sort of tone marking, and they don't really interact with each other, and they don't move very much. That's how tone languages, or that's how tone systems work in East and Southeast Asia, in the so-called mainland Southeast Asian linguistic area, except for a few cases like Shanghainese where they've moved on from that. But outside of that tone typology is basically non-existent. There's a couple places. The one I'm aware of is Yao in Western New Guinea. But every other language that uses tone does something completely different from that. It is much closer to a prototype of some things are marked, but not necessarily every syllable all the time. Tones move around, they get reassigned, they get deleted. Contours are just what happens when you squeeze two marked tones onto one syllable. And so I feel like if people had seen a lot of this stuff before, back in the day, when a lot of these languages were rather less accessible, but if they had been more accessible at the time, when people were setting up this category of pitch accent, I don't know that anybody would have come up with it. They would have just been like, oh, what's going on in East Asia? Those are some strange tone systems. And the whole idea that, like, that is what tone is would never have come up. So it just sort of underscores the idea that, like, when you're doing these typological studies and trying to understand what do linguistic systems do, you've got to look at as wide a sample as you can possibly get your hands on, because otherwise you may end up with these weird biases towards, like, oh, well, we've got this one group of things that's doing this other sort of a thing, and so we're going to understand it in terms of that group. Maybe there's a bunch of other languages that are doing that thing, and you need to look at those too, because they do it in completely different ways. So anyway, that's the soapbox that I have. You always have to look at everything you can get your hands on when you're doing these things, but, like, this makes it really clear.
Right, okay, so thank you for your comment, Aidan. That was quite important to say, I felt like. Even though I didn't have that much to say this episode, in the next episode I will talk a bit more, perhaps. Because in the next episode we will be discussing Coordinating Constructions and Overview by Martin Hasselmatt. This was Theory Neutral. See you next time.